The topic that I'm going to address today is navigating the path for large infrastructure projects. And before turning to the details of the slides I want to go through with you today, I wanted just to share with you some reflections that I have, having been in this field for over 20 years. It really used to be the case that permitting a large infrastructure project and going through the environmental review process was relatively straightforward. The federal process usually went smoothly. The state agencies usually followed in line with the federal process. The question of environmental compliance was usually addressed in a concise manner. However, I think everyone sitting in this room has seen changes, and those changes have occurred over time, and they are continuing to change and become ever more complex. My recommendation to you as you think about this question of how to navigate any kind of infrastructure project that you're dealing with is how you can best spend your resources up front. That is to plan your project, bring an integrated team together and map out your strategy, trying to do that well in advance of making your project public and beginning the public involvement process. So let's turn now to what are some of the key elements in developing a large infrastructure project. First of all, the obvious one is environmental compliance. And when I'm talking about environmental compliance, I don't limit it to any particular statute. There are a number of them that can be important as you go along. Many of you are probably familiar with the National Environmental Policy Act. That's a key federal statute. There's the Clean Water Act that oftentimes will be at issue in your project. The Clean Air Act is another statute to consider. And for those of you in Wyoming and out west, there are always issues that seem to be cropping up under the Endangered Species Act. While NEPA is essentially a procedural statute, it is something to be very careful about as you plan and work with your agencies to comply with the procedural steps. Others of these statutes that I just mentioned are more substantive in nature, and in fact, they may put constraints on what you're able to do with your project. So you have to, as I suggested at the outset, be careful when you're planning your project and formulate a strategy right up front. On the flip side, some of these statutes may provide you with opportunities as well, so it's two sides of the coin to be evaluating. The second point is permitting strategy. Permitting is different from environmental compliance, and I'll use to illustrate that point the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act, many of you may have had experience with it in terms of getting a 404 permit, which is a dredge and fill permit. That particular regulatory regime has very exacting requirements for the Corps. And the Corps must determine, after evaluation of a range of alternatives, what is the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative, something that we fondly call the lead path. Why is that important? Well, again, as you're formulating your project, as you're thinking about your strategy, the 404B1 can be different from NEPA. It is different from NEPA, and it requires careful consideration and strategy as you go along. Coordination with federal, state, and local governmental entities and tribal entities. What I'm talking about there is really the question of getting together with your federal agencies, discussing with them how they're going to proceed. Bring your state and local agencies into the loop and have a plan of coordination. You can set up policies. You should have some understanding as a project component of how you're going to proceed. We oftentimes find that formulating what I would call a memorandum of understanding on coordination with these agencies, whether it's federal agency to federal agency, is that better? Or MOUs that can address the relationship between state and federal governmental entities can be very useful. It can also help you try to establish with these agencies an appropriate timeline for evaluation of your project. So let's turn now to Wyoming. Obviously, it's safe to say, everybody in this room already knows this, that the state is a leader in energy development. The industries represented in the state are varied, from transmission to renewable energy, mining, oil and gas, and rail and other transportation support. And I'd like to emphasize the rail and other transportation support later in this discussion this morning, because transportation is key to getting energy products out of the state, whether these products are going to be used domestically or for export. I've discussed already, I'll go through this quickly, a few of the relevant regulatory regimes that can affect your projects. The Corps of Engineers, we've chatted about already, the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service, which has control over projects located on federal lands. Department of Energy coordinates reviews for proposed interstate transmission line projects, and state environmental laws and local permitting requirements. And for example, I know Montana DEQ has been present here, at least yesterday, and is involved for many of your projects. Okay, let's turn now to the federal agency role. I'm from Washington, D.C., and have practiced law there for over 20 years, so I've had a lot of dealings with these federal agencies. The Council on Environmental Quality, as many of you may know, is based in D.C. It is responsible for the NEPA statute. It promulgates regulations under the NEPA statute, and also, very importantly, it establishes guidance under the statute, which if you have extra time on your hands, it's well worth taking a look at their website. CEQ sometimes get involved in project-specific issues, and that can occur if your project is controversial, if the federal agencies don't seem to be able to coordinate well together. And I also note on this slide that you may be familiar, several of the federal agencies have their own NEPA regulations. However, the CEQ still sort of reigns supreme, and many of the guidance documents that they've developed can be quite helpful. Okay, I would be remiss if I didn't take a few moments to talk with you about the EPA. EPA can and sometimes is, at a project proponent's request, a cooperating agency in an environmental review. More often than not, they're not. However, EPA still plays an important role, and that role is that EPA grades, under law, they must do this, every draft EIS. If they have strong objections, the lead agency may decide to make significant revisions to your document, or sometimes when the grade is absolutely failing an F, you may find that the agency decides to prepare a supplemental document. And why is this important? Well, it's important because if you're operating on a time schedule, this can cause a substantial delay and also create a lot of controversy. It's also noteworthy that when EPA criticizes your document, that you will oftentimes see project opponents will take that criticism and use it later on. And they use it later on to file legal claims and utilize the EPA's criticism as a basis for the lack of sufficiency of the document. Going back now to the Clean Water Act again, and this is another very important role that EPA plays, and that is that EPA can elevate a Corps permit. When the Corps is ready to issue your permit, the EPA can basically say, we don't agree with what the Corps is doing here. They elevate it and they prevent its issuance until EPA's concerns have been addressed. This usually goes to pretty high political levels before it's resolved. And lastly and importantly, EPA has also asserted the right to veto an already issued Corps permit and has done so. And they are also asserting the right to preemptively veto a Corps permit. The first issue, the retroactive veto, is actually on its way now in terms of litigation to the U.S. Supreme Court. You may want to continue to watch that case. There are industries all over Washington, trade association groups that have been involved in that matter. On the preemptive veto, where you may see reference to that particular topic, is the Pebble Mine proposal up in Alaska. Gina McCarthy, I'm sure you've all heard her name. She's the new EPA administrator. She's stated she is placing an emphasis on collaboration with industry and that she sees EPA's job as ensuring the use of modern technology. She's also said she's not going about setting new energy policy. So I think we'll all have to wait and see how that works out. I think she's in her honeymoon period right now. All right, I wanted to spend some time this morning talking about the National Historic Preservation Act. I don't know how many of you have familiarity with the statute and have bumped into the delays that can occur when the process doesn't move in the direction that you would like it to go. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this with the idea that the work I'm currently doing in Wyoming and in other western states, many project opponents are running into problems with what we call NHPA. So just to kind of cut to the quick on the overview, I've set forth in these slides what NHPA is all about. It's just a general goal that Congress has stated to preserve historic and cultural foundation of the nation. And a federal agency that has jurisdiction over your project, a lead agency, has to comply with NHPA, as it does with NEPA, if the approval that he is going to grant for your project has the potential to affect properties that are historic or significant to tribes and are eligible for listing on the National Register. I put this slide in to see if I could confuse everyone. It's a flow chart that depicts how 106 ought to occur, and you can reference this later when you have a chance. The point I wanted to make for the moment is you can see, just as with NEPA on that left-hand column, there is substantial public involvement, something that people sometimes forget. So let's do a little deeper dive. Exactly what is 106? Like NEPA, it is procedural and normally, as I showed in the last slide, should work in a step-by-step process. The lead federal agency must engage in these effective consultations, not only with tribes, but with other stakeholders that are interested in the project. And among those that need to be involved are the project proponent. Oftentimes people forget that the project proponent is a consulting party. And you have to remind the agencies of that as they move along. The goal is to establish a reasonable area of potential effect for the study and then move forward to identify historic and cultural resources. Once that is done, you determine whether you will have adverse effects by looking at the direct and indirect effects of your project, and ultimately you go to resolution of those effects. Sometimes, really, the 106 process is a mystery. And it's a mystery not only to applicants, but believe it or not, it's a mystery to agencies. And yet it is absolutely key to complete 106 before you can get a record of decision of approval for your project. So unbeknownst to applicants, you can and should participate in the 106 process. There are ways to delegate authority to an applicant so that the applicant can have a leadership role in the 106 process. So we're going to take a few minutes to briefly look at the other agencies that are involved besides the lead agency in the process. The Advisory Council, again based in Washington, is an independent agency that is supposed to support preservation of our resources. It is responsible for the statute, for the implementing regulations, and the guidance to advance these goals. ACHP normally doesn't have a direct role in your particular project unless a conflict arises or if there is a issue where either the tribal interests, the federal agency, or even the applicant wants to go and get some guidance from ACHP. Okay, on the state level, you all may have heard and may actually have already worked closely with the Wyoming State Historic Preservation Officer. The slide sort of sets forth what the role is there. The SHPO is a critical and key component of the 106 process. It undertakes many functions together with a lead agency. It has its own protocols and guidance in Wyoming, so that you should just pay attention to that so you don't run into any hiccups as you move along in consulting with the Wyoming SHPO. There is a theme that I wanted to discuss this morning that we're seeing, and I'm going to put it under the rubric of common tribal issues. And this is not to single out the tribes in any negative way. In fact, it is something very positive. Engagement with the tribes early on to learn what their issues may be can really help the project proponent. So the topic that has come up is traditional cultural properties. TCPs, as they're known, are not defined in regulation, but they are identified in consultation with the tribal interests. When it comes to TCPs, there are a lot of issues, trying to focus on what the key survey areas to identify the TCPs, what level of effort has to be expended, how to interpret the findings. Then you have the whole question of eligibility determination, and I would underscore for you the question of the integrity issue. There's a lot of places throughout the state where even if TCPs are present, there's integrity issues because of past industrial development, and so those should all be taken into account. I note for you that in 2013, the state SHPO nominated as eligible only 8 sites, 2 or 3 of which appear to be traditional cultural properties. So the outcome of 106 is to reach agreement. I'm going to run out of time here, so I'm going to scoot through these slides pretty quickly. The gist of this is that when you are going to have an adverse effect on cultural and historic properties, you need to move towards resolution through agreement. 2 methods of agreement. One is called an MOA, or Memorandum of Agreement. The other is a programmatic agreement. And a programmatic agreement can be more appropriate for a phased or linear project where the survey work will be done after you get your approval to proceed. I mentioned a number of current events. Some of you, again, may have seen this already. There's a great handbook that CEQ put out on how to integrate NEPA and NHPA. It talks about basically either coordinating these efforts to avoid duplicative efforts or actually using the NEPA procedures to comply with NHPA. This slide just sets forth some concepts for successful integration. This is out of the handbook, and you can read about it if you have time and want to look at the handbook. In Wyoming, of course, there are these pending transmission line proposals. I'm not spending time on those. I know others are going to discuss those. And what I really wanted to draw your attention to are 2 very recent federal issuances addressing transmission line projects. The first is this June 7th, 2013 presidential memorandum that is encouraging the use of common corridors on federal lands for siting. The second was just issued last week, August 29th, and there's a request for information out there on a whole series of ideas how to pre-plan your projects and get them going before you've actually filed your permit application. So I commend you to take a look at that and see if you want to comment on it. Again, in the interest of time, I just wanted to point out, other than transmission, there is a lot of things going on in the state. Port terminal expansion and rail improvements are occurring outside the state. There's activity in the Gulf and in the Pacific Northwest, all with an eye towards export of energy products. Opposition is coming from unanticipated sources, and the best way to handle that is to look at what's happened in the past and try to avoid it in the future. I don't know, those of you who are involved in coal, you may have seen this law review article. Columbia Law School set out a very detailed handbook for opponents. It details how to attack these projects where the goal is to get U.S. coal exported, and of course it directly affects the Powder River Basin. The opposition to coal has a mantra. You can read this slide to see what their views are on coal. It's not a pretty picture, but at least they put it out there for us to see in public. They've advised citizens and watchdog groups to get involved in the scoping process and to ensure that the EIS that these agencies will be doing are as broad as possible. Recent requests for expanded studies by agencies include, and these are kind of unprecedented, for NEPA reviews, coal dust, including human health impacts, studies of grade crossings and rail traffic impacts from origin to points of export, life cycle analysis of potential GHG emissions from energy combustion. Those are all on the table now as part of the review. So I'm going to conclude with a wrap-up for you. My recommendations. First, build an integrated team, do your homework, and be proactive with your agencies using the existing tools, the rules and guidance to your advantage. Reviewing agencies have jurisdiction, they can serve as cooperating, and we should all be careful to understand in advance what the limits of their authority is. On the scope of review, it's important for the applicant to take the lead to define the project, what it is and what it is not, and to define the purpose and need for the project. In terms of shaping the review, I always recommend think long-term, including potential litigation. Document the agency decisions, and if the agency doesn't put a piece of paper in the file, then you put one in the file for them, and create a strategy with hot-button issues up front. Again, this is something that you shouldn't rely on the agencies to do. And that concludes my remarks this morning.